Okay, welcome. So today we're going to start a new topic, and our topic is going to be the intellectual soul. What is the intellectual soul? I thought you kept saying that there's two souls, right? There's the animal soul and the divine soul. That's the order in which he brings them to the Tanya. First you learn about the animal soul, then you learn about the divine soul. So, first of all, there's a diuk that's known from the Alter Rebbe that came down not through the Rebbes themselves, it came down through a family member. The second chapter of Tanya begins, V'anefesh hashanit b'Yisrael hi chelek Eloka mimal. So the second soul in Israel, and it is a part of God above, is so and so is. So the question is, why did he have to add the word Israel? He should have just said, the second soul is a part of God above. That's all.
It's Jewish.
What do you mean? So is there another option?
No.
So yes. Yeah. So yes. Go with it. Go. Right. Don't back down.
Okay.
You're climbing up the right tree. So the idea is that in Am Yisrael, the second soul is the divine soul. This is the Nefesh Elokit. But everybody has two souls. We once said this. You can't understand the behavior of a person if you don't assume that he has at least two different personalities inside, two different identities, at least.
Are you talking about Jews and non-Jews or just Jews?
First of all, we're talking about everybody.
Everybody, okay.
Every person on this earth has a split personality. It has to be, because you can't begin to understand what people are doing. If you can't begin to understand the inconsistencies, the paradoxes within every person, the tension which actually makes the person into a person. You have to have tension. The moment you don't have any tension, you're not alive. That's exactly the difference between somebody who's alive and somebody who's not. When you're alive, so there's tension in the muscles. There's the body's tense. It's together. When the soul departs, everything becomes lax. Everything falls apart because there's nothing to hold it. So tension is what is the major ingredient or sign, symptom of something being alive. So in the body, that's what we say tension, between the bones and the sinews that hold them together. In the psyche, the tension is at least between two different things. There have to be two different things pulling in different directions, and that is a sign that the person is alive. We've talked about this many times. I'll just remind you, we won't go into it right now, that in Chassidus, the sign of someone being alive, the heartbeat of the psyche, is called Ratzov Vashov, run and return. That you're constantly running and returning. Where are you running to? I'm running to God. What am I returning to? I'm returning to myself. So another way of saying that is I'm running and returning between my divine soul and my animal soul, and I'm constantly I have a heartbeat all the time. This is the beat, the rhythm of life from the psyche's perspective. So in a non-Jew there has to be the same thing also. So what is the second soul in a non-Jew? The intellectual soul. Where does he say that? He says it at the end of the first chapter in Tanya. We're not going to look at it right now. We're going to leave that for a later class because there's some advanced topics there. But at the end of the very first chapter, he talks about something that he calls the levush, the garment. And he says that the parents give the children a garment, a spiritual garment. And that garment is instrumental in what kind of person the child is going to be. Therefore, the parents have to have a good kavanah when they are together and when they conceive the child. And it all depends on that. But kavanah, right away you understand, has to do with the intellect. The kavanah is not some kind of mystical thing. It's not just something you can't put you're not allowed to put something like this in your bedroom. You can't look at one of these. That's not going to work. Shiviti like this. Yeah.
Intellectual soul and divine soul are the same thing.
So that's what we're saying. There's something else.
Wait, is it a third soul?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's
But
a
we
third
don't have
soul.
that?
Okay.
Well, of course we do.
Of
course we do.
3 then?
We have at least 3. We said many times we have hundreds. There's a whole zoo of them. They're like elementary particles. The more you research, the more you discover that there's a soul. And that later in this series, we'll take a look at the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos, which is called the 8 chapters, and that is his, call it the anatomy of the soul, as far as the Rambam is concerned. We'll look at that and try to understand how it's similar and how it's different from what we say in Chassidus, and why it might be that in the Rambam's time that was more fitting. In our time, the Chasidic description is more is more utilitarian, has more utility for us. So that was handed down, that was passed down from the Alter Rebbe, but not through the Rebbeim, was passed down through family members who heard this from him. It wasn't uncommon. Things like this happened. The people went into the Alter Rebbe, they talked to him about something, and he suddenly told them something that no one else heard. He never repeated again. And it just passed down. So the idea is that the second soul, by everyone, there's a second soul. By non-Jews, it is the intellectual soul. And they have to have an intellectual soul, because otherwise there's no tension. The intellectual soul is basically what most psychologists would say is what keeps you in society, what keeps you able to do things that are beyond your immediate needs. Right? You're able to see a bigger picture than just the lunch that you want to eat. Right? You need the intellectual soul in order to see something wider than just yourself. So in that sense, the intellectual soul is the opening into society, one would say. And without that, I can't really function in society, unless I have a very, very specific type of animal soul, which is very, we'd say, egregious, which loves being in a herd, and it wants to be with people, and that's what makes it feel good, so you're like an extrovert. Which actually is not that uncommon, because I think the numbers of extroverts versus introverts in the world is something like 80-20 towards the extroverts. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Huh?
Is the intellectual soul?
People I know introverts.
Everybody here is an introvert, of course, but because you wouldn't come to hear me. I'm a total introvert, so nobody would be able to stay with me more than one class if they weren't an introvert. But anyway, yeah. Sorry.
Did you say the intellectual soul is like the moral?
So a lot of times that's the moral aspect of people. It's what provides a higher perspective on reality. But we'll look at it that there's in Chassidus, and the Rebbe talked about this a lot. There's a push to turn the intellectual soul into something more than just morals. There are moral people in the world, and moral people, in general, we'd think that their morals came from Torah, but they don't necessarily have to come from Torah. It could be that they never learned Torah, they have no connection. Either culture is not connected. I don't know if there is such a thing today in the world, but certainly there were 300, 400 years ago such things. And people had morals, and there's something called like natural morality or innate morality, and that comes from the intellectual soul.
So I'm trying hard to understand what the difference is between the intellectual soul and the spiritual soul.
Like the divine soul.
Right.
Well, think of a professor in a university. Okay, he's not like a dock worker. Okay, somebody working on the docks. He's not like a taxi driver. He's doing something else with his life. He's dedicating his life to something that we would say is higher. It's a higher calling, right? And he's developing it in a different way. He's leading his life in a different way. We treat them differently, and governments and society in general invests in creating people like that, because there's an understanding that you need to have people who have intelligence, that have developed their intellect, right? So it doesn't mean that someone else, that the taxi driver doesn't have that, but he's not functioning there most of the time, or he's using that in a very limited sense.
You could be the most intellectual, but the most immoral person.
Right?
Also.
You also could be. Yeah. You could be
that's
very,
where-
very
that's where
intellectual.
I'm
Yeah,
going.
I mean, a lot of people.
People who have a high development of this
The intellectual soul.
So, to the detriment of
Yeah.
Of their moral side.
what's happening there. I mean, it's
That,
like,
that can definitely
it
happen.
Seems like it's
Right, it can definitely happen. There definitely is such a thing. But, unfortunately, there can also be a person with a very, theoretically, right, in terms of theory, it looks that way,
Yeah.
as a very, very well developed divine soul, and yet morally scrupulous, like, has problems. Right? That can happen also. So there's a whole problem with that. In Yiddishkeit, in the end, we would say, if your behavior does not fit your divine development, so you really haven't developed your divine. So what have you been doing? And here's where it comes in. You've been developing your intellectual soul and calling it your divine soul. And that's very easy to do because Torah is very intellectual. So a person could easily fall into that trap and be developing his intellectual soul a lot, and not knowing that he's just been using the Torah as sort of like a textbook, like someone would do that in college, and he's been studying Torah in an intellectual way. But it hasn't really touched upon his divine soul. He really hasn't developed that yet. Sorry, I have to plug this in because it's running out of battery. I thought it was.
Define introvert and extrovert.
Can I define
You're
it?
doing it. Because you said we're all introverts.
Well, just a second.
I just wanted to know.
No, he said only 20%.
Yeah.
He said, but we all are. We wouldn't be with him because he is. That's what he said. He said he's an introvert. So we're all introverts because we're with him.
I don't know.
I was saying it a little bit as a joke.
I know, so that's
You're
why
right.
still there's something
So
behind it.
the definition, the definition is actually pretty easy. Why did it not turn on? Oh, what's going on? Oh, here we go. Okay. The definition is easy. What do you get your energy from? Do you get your energy from being alone or from being with other people? When you want to refresh yourself, what do? Do you go to a party? Or do you go sit and read a book?
By the sea, yeah.
Or by the sea, even better.
Well, I think it depends on it depends on the moment because it could go both ways with someone.
So what's more common in your life? So I would never go to a party, like even if they paid me. Like if I don't have to, like really have to, I wouldn't go there. I have nothing to, like it just seeps my energy. I can do it, I can go through the motions, it's not that I can't be social, I can. But the weight of it and the amount of energy I'll expend there is just ridiculous. It will be work. But there are people who go to parties and feel refreshed. And that's actually most of the people in the world. And only some of the people in the world are the other way around. Anyway, so that was just as an aside. But let's get back to this idea. This is an incredible idea because most of the time when you read Tanya, so he hardly mentions the intellectual soul. You have to get into the other writings. And the other writings are really the most important one. Even if you learn all the Alter Rebbe's Maimarim, all of his essays, you'll still be hard-pressed to find where he talks about the intellectual soul, even though it's so important. So there's a whole question of why he doesn't even talk about it. So the simple answer is that the entire Tanya is about the intellectual soul. And I'll try to demonstrate with an example. We've actually mentioned this example before, but we used it for something else. Who is the narrator of the Torah? Who's narrating?
Of the Torah?
Yeah.
Hashem wrote to Moshe.
It says, Hashem said to Moshe. So Hashem can't be narrating.
Okay, so then Moshe.
Moshe's definitely not narrating. It says he's in the third person there also.
Oh my gosh, that freaks me out.
So that's one of the initial questions that the Nachmanides, the Ramban, asks
Oh, that
in his
really
commentary.
freaks me out.
So who's narrating?
Whose voice is it?
Right. Whose voice? That's exactly how we would say it in literature.
Whoa.
So who's the voice here? Who's saying this? So the Ramban comes up with this phrase he calls Shlishi HaMedaber, third person speaking. Obviously it's God, but it's an aspect of God that is not God, right? It's not when you say God. God wrote the Torah. God. It's a voice that he assumes, he takes on, and is now narrating. Now, what exactly that voice is, it's a certain aspect of godliness, right? So this is a topic I don't want to get into because it's a huge topic, and we've discussed a little bit of it in the past but here I want to take it in the same direction of two things. When you say something, I went to the post office, who is speaking? Because you're addressing yourself as I. So is it I that am speaking, or is there something else that's speaking about I? So it's closer. It's not like when I say God, there are people who talk about themselves in the third person, right? They say
The royalty.
yeah. But that's a little weird. But we say I. So who is this I that we're referring to? So this we've said many times, that's the intellectual soul. The intellectual soul is the I. Who is choosing between the divine soul and the animal soul? So again, the answer is usually the way it's brought in Chassidus is, especially by the sixth Rebbe, the Friediger Rebbe, it's the intellectual soul that's choosing. And someone asked me, because I'm also teaching a little bit like this in the morning classes, we're learning a Maimer of Chassidus. So somebody asked me, so the intellectual soul is which one? The I is which one? The animal soul or the divine soul? So no, intellectual starts with I.
Yeah.
That's the siman, that's the sign. The intellectual soul is the I. Usually. It can change. There are people who are outliers where it's different. But by most regular people, the I is really the intellectual soul. Now, why did I say this about the Tanya? Why did I mention this in terms of the Tanya? Who's writing the Tanya? Who wrote the Tanya? So the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya. But who in the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya? Did he write it from his divine soul, or did he write it from his animal soul? So there's a famous thing that says that whatever he was writing about, he assumed, meaning he invested himself in that identity. So if he's writing about the divine soul, so now he's assuming the role of the divine soul. And he's writing from a direct experience of what it's like to be a divine soul. When he's writing about the animal soul, he's investing himself in the animal soul and talking about the direct experience of being an animal soul. So who is this who's investing himself here and here? So the answer is it's the Alter Rebbe's intellectual soul. He wrote the Tanya itself. The entire Tanya is actually, what's it called? The book of the intermediates. The book of the Beinonim. The Beinoni is the intellectual soul. Okay, this is a big chiddush. It's a lot to take in the beginning, because we're used to thinking about Beinoni as just sort of like a state. We're not used to thinking about him as an embodiment, not embodiment, but a reflection of a certain entity in us. But that's really what's going on. The entire Tanya, he doesn't say it outright, and that's a big question why he doesn't say it outright, but that's why I gave the example of the Torah. The Torah never tells us who this third person speaking is. You have to sort of figure it out by yourself. That there's an aspect of God that's able to talk about God in the third person. So in the Alter Rebbe, it's like he's speaking about his divine soul, he's speaking about his animal soul, and he remains detached from both, or at least able to look at both and invest himself in each one of them as he needs. But that requires there to be a third soul. And that's usually the soul that is writing most of Torah. By all of us, by all the Torah that we read. It's very what's in maybe the strongest example of this in the entire Torah is a book of Proverbs. That all the wisdom that Solomon has, he explains both sides of the equation. He says, this is what the wise man is like, and this is what the foolish man is like. This is what the God-fearing man is like, this is what the man who has no scruples is like. And so on. And so where is he? He's the intellectual soul. And most of the time, most of what goes on in the world is really the intellectual soul. When we daven, for instance, So we try to move. That's the whole. Call it the greatness of davening, which is I can assume at least for an hour during the day, I can assume a higher role. I can become my divine soul. But when I go into the shower, it's like King David, and he went into the bathroom, into the bathhouse, and he says, I have no mitzvot, I have nothing. So where are my mitzvot? Where am I? So what am I? Because the animal soul feels very stripped. It's not, there's nothing holy there. It doesn't feel like anything holy. He says, oh, thankfully, my body already contains a mitzvah. And our bodies are holy in that sense. So even the animal soul, which is very much linked to the body, like the blood is the nefesh, the blood is the animal soul, at least the energy within the blood, the rhythm of the blood, the running of the blood. So there he felt that he was assuming his identity as an animal soul. So this is a very important concept, because first of all, this is where the drama of humanity is happening. It's happening mostly in the intellectual soul. We have these two more extreme states, the divine soul and the animal soul, and most of what goes on in our lives, and most of what goes on in everyone's life, non-Jews alike, is actually in the intellectual soul. And that's where people communicate. It's true that some people communicate with their sword and with their fists and things like that, and that would be like in a certain sense, the animal soul. But that is still a small percentage of the interactions that happen in the world. And most of the interactions that happen between people, they happen at the intellectual level. It could be by speaking. That's our usual mode of communication. Yeah.
So up until now, my understanding was that when you die, your animal soul dies, but your godly soul lives. So what happens to the intellectual soul?
Great question. That's why we're going to look at the Rambam, because the Rambam has a lot to say about that. In a short answer, because you already asked, I can't say something. The short answer is that he says that the intellectual soul is hanging in the balance. Is what's really hanging in the balance. Is it going to continue on or not? And that depends on what a person does in his lifetime. And Am Yisrael is trying to push the world, basically according to the Rambam's point of view, we're constantly trying to push the world to deal with higher truths, higher knowledge. And eventually, as the Rebbe then put it, that we're at a stage now where we can push the higher knowledge of the Torah. That's really what we're trying to get them to do. Meaning, in the Rebbe's translation of this, it's we don't want them to keep 7 mitzvos because they are moral people, right? Because it's naturally better to live this way than to live otherwise. We want them to keep the 7 mitzvot. We want them to be God-fearing people because God commanded that. Meaning, it's not just it's not something that is humanly contrived. This whole idea, and the Rebbe talked about this a tremendous amount. And one of the most beautiful examples of it was that there's a passage in the Rambam in the Halachas, not in the 8 chapters, the introduction to Pirkei Avos, but in his Halacha book, where he writes that a non-Jew who keeps the 7 mitzvos because of his intellect, because he understands this to be the proper way to live, is not, capitalized not, amongst the wise men of the non-Jews. Why? He just told me that he's keeping it because his wisdom dictates that this is the way that you should lead your life. This is the way that a well-functioning society should operate. Why would the Rambam right away say, and he's not from their wise men even? So the Rebbe has a lot of, not once, not twice, he talked about this strange Rambam, and he explained in the end because we want. Before I tell you what he said, You're very close.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can feel it.
So, but as the Rebbe was teaching in the 70s, manuscripts of the Rambam began appearing. And in the manuscripts, there was just one letter that was different. Instead of velo michachmehem, and not of their wise men, the manuscript said ela michachmehem. He's not God-fearing, but he is from their wise men. Not from their wise men, but he is from their wise men. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's how you would expect him to say that, because he came to these conclusions from his wisdom, not from being God-fearing, just because he was wise. But the Rebbe said, since we have, for generations, had this reading, and this is the one that's been printed and accepted, and everybody learned according to it, and you can learn a lot about how the Rebbe sees our tradition. So we need to explain velo michachmeim, that he's not amongst their wise men. So he says it. What does it mean he's not amongst their wise men? Because wisdom is always bittul. It's always nullification. He has no nullification because, like you said, he's coming to that from his will, from his ego, to create a better life for himself. But he's not coming to those mitzvot. He's not coming to these types of behavior because God commanded him, because he has some nullification before a higher power. And so he's not even amongst their wise men. Maybe he's amongst those who understand, because Bina is not bittul. But he can't be among their wise men, because wise men is all, to be wise is always to have Ruach HaKodesh. It's always to have some kind of divine inspiration. And he doesn't have any divine inspiration because he's coming to fulfill his own needs.
So what happens when it stops there, when a person just
Stop.
never gets there?
Right. So that, he says, the Rebbe says constantly, is the role of the Jewish people. To show, and that's why for the Rebbe this was, there was for the entire people, this was a tremendous trauma. That here you had the high culture of Germany turned into Nazi Germany, and that was one of the strongest experimental indicators, very pragmatic and empirical, that just deciding to lead a moral life because it's better, there's more utility in it, is no guarantee for moral behavior. In fact, it can completely collapse. As if it's not tied above, if it's not coming from being God-fearing, then there are no guarantees that this behavior will actually continue.
Social justice.
So, because of so in general, I think even without the Holocaust, the Rebbe would have said this: that our role is to ensure that people are moral, non-Jews are moral, not because human nature dictates that that's better, but rather because they are nullified before God. That they are God-fearing. Now, it shouldn't be such a big problem because 95% of the world believes in God. So the only question is, can you convince them that the morality they should adopt is coming from the Torah and not from somewhere else? That should be the only real change, and that should not be that hard, because it's very easy to talk about Jewish morals, meaning Torah morality versus any other type of morality, and see the tremendous difference between them.
Well, do Hindus and Buddhists say they believe in God?
Yeah, well, the Buddhists less, so more of a problem, but the Hindus definitely.
They're a big percentage, aren't they?
Yeah, they're one.
Chinese people will tell you
The
that.
Chinese are the real exception, and I told
Right.
you last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, that Rav Ginsburg is now going to give a whole thing about China, because that's, he called it Olam Atov. That's the world of chaos. It's the name of God hasn't appeared there, and when it does appear, like in the form of the Christians there, which are, I think they call them the Gang, what are they called? The guys who put out the Epoch Times. Fu Gong, I don't know, whatever.
He put out, he was a Christian.
They're Christians. So, Falun Gong.
Falun
Falun Gong.
kind of God?
No.
Mhm.
They don't have,
God?
for a long, long time. I don't know when they actually had a concept of an all-powerful, omniscient God. They're very, very in a different world than we are in that sense. Anyways, and there you see that you got the feeling that convincing them of a morality that's rooted in something higher is going to be very difficult.
Weren't there Chinese monks?
Yeah, they're monks.
There are monks, but they don't believe in God.
What was their thing? I mean,
They
if
do
there
believe in
wasn't God,
Buddhism.
what was there?
Some kind of energy, because look at their medical system. All energy.
Right, but it's not.
It's
It's not a entity. It's
No.
just it's like the force.
Yeah, it really is.
exactly.
It's just everywhere.
That's what
Yeah,
Buddhist
chi.
has this infinite.
But if they ever decide, if they ever were lit, like, they might be amazing.
Maybe not. Maybe they're just like children, and they just have to hear that there's something higher. But everyone says for some reason that the children are very, very aware of God. The reason they're very aware of God is because we've talked about this in the past. Because when a child is growing up, so the natural fear, respect, dependence, call it anything you want, with their parents is how their conception of God is built. So they definitely already, the child has that. But as they grow older, they lose it. They become less and less dependent. When it's very dependent, then they have a real conception of godliness. As they grow older, it's less and less.
So that's in Chinese culture, because what is very important, my husband worked in China, so what is very important with Chinese is your ancestry, and everything is very much, you give, like you have a yahrzeit and you light a candle and we say prayers. They have their customs that they do on their family members on their anniversary of their day.
So that reminds me a lot of Japan. They're very similar, these cultures, all the entire Far East in that sense. In Japan, the whole religion is Shinto in general, is a lot of ancestor worship. And unfortunately, when an adult does that, it's not the same thing. A child feels the dependence. The adult doesn't feel any dependence. It's just like a charm. It's like some kind of way for me to gain more. So it's coming entirely from the animal soul. So okay, this is an interesting question.
We should never ask anything from whether.
When you go to the Ohel,
Right?
What's right?
don't you ask the Rebbe for things, for brachas and stuff like that?
So first of all, you shouldn't.
Yeah, I never heard
You
that
should
either.
ask Hashem in the merit of the Rebbe. But
yeah, that's what I meant.
so that's different. It's very different.
But
But, and then there's a big but here, and this is where it gets tricky, that people would ask the Rebbe when he was alive, I want a bracha from you. And we have nothing against that. The person should be a conduit for the bracha. The problem is when they're not alive. So this is where it gets, so thankfully, I don't want to get into the whole topic, but thankfully it turns out that the ones who think he is alive don't go to the Ohel, so they never have this problem. And the ones who don't think he's alive, they go to the Ohel, and they don't ask, so everything worked out in the end.
Yeah,
But it's one of those places where there could be a crossover and it could get really sticky theologically,
So somebody
halachically.
who's dead could be a conduit?
They could still be a conduit in a certain sense. It's in the merit of what they did, meaning that what they set up in the world is sort of like a conduit. But I don't ask them, I ask Hashem.
So when people are writing the Rebbe on the internet, they'll say, I know, somebody told me, do you want me to write the Rebbe for you?
So when you write to him and you ask him to be a conduit, so that's fine.
I didn't.
But if you ask him,
Make sure that they're asking
right?
that the Rebbe is a conduit for
Right.
the question.
They used to, the traditional, it's a little bit out of our topic here, but the traditional opening of a letter of this type to the Rebbe, which was called a pan, a pidyon nefesh, was, I'm asking the Rebbe to awaken rachamim rabim, to awaken great compassion from the source of great compassion on my naran chai, on the 5 levels of my soul. That used to be the common way to open one of these letters. And then the Rebbe himself said, don't give the Rebbe ideas about how to do things. And so people stopped writing that. He said, don't interfere with how he does it. It doesn't matter how he does it. You don't tell him where to take it from. Which is basically what he's saying. But he wasn't saying the Rebbe is giving it to you. It's not that he's awakening something. Of course he's awakening something. The question is where is he awakening it? So don't write out this whole formula that do it from here or do it from there. Leave him alone. He'll figure out where he wants to.
Why is an intermediary? I mean, Hashem is the ultimate.
Why go to a doctor? He's also an intermediary.
Oh, okay.
Why? The whole world works by intermediaries. We'd like to not have to eat. I ate yesterday. Why do I have to eat today? And yet the food is the intermediary for me to get energy. But in the future, it says that we will get the energy directly from the Shekhinah.
Well,
we won't have to.
Angels, right?
What?
We like the angels.
So there's a lot of problem there too. And in the end, when we're asking them to act as an intermediary, then it passes. But still nobody's happy with it. Because again, simple people, they don't. The simple mashal of kissing the postman when he brings you your check has not been heard by the entire world yet. If nobody kisses the postman, you're thankful for the check. You don't care who brought it. I mean, it's a little complex, this whole story. Anyway, let's get back to the intellectual soul. Okay, so the whole Beinoni is actually the intellectual soul. This is what when you're developing the intermediate state, what you're really doing is you're developing your intellectual soul so that it knows how to translate between the divine soul and the animal soul. There's no direct link between them, because the divine soul is interested with one thing, and the animal soul has a completely different language, and it doesn't understand the language of the divine soul. And so you need to have some way to translate between them. That's the role of the intellectual soul. Okay. So it's basically a translator. It's a go-between. And the more you develop it, the more you understand. And a lot of Chassidus is not godly soul. A lot of it is not. A lot of it is intellectual soul. It's an attempt to try to phrase ideas from the Torah which are very lofty and very difficult to understand spiritually in a language that even the animal soul can understand. What do we mean by the animal soul? So let's take one small example, and this will set us up for all the next classes that we'll talk about this. We can ask, to see how different they are in their understanding, we can ask, what does each one believe in? Each one has a belief that's at its core. If you remember, we talked many times about that when you're helping someone, when you're advising them, counseling them, what's the first step? The first step is always to restore their faith. Because in the Arizal, all the time, whenever something is built, whatever a spiritual entity is being built, it starts from the crown, from the highest part of the crown. And then it filters down, it cascades down. So you have to have faith, first of all, because that is the highest part of the crown. We call that the unknowable head. So, for instance, if I went through trauma with something, and I don't want to go to that place anymore, or I don't want to be with people, or I try to avoid it. And because of that, my life is ruined in a certain respect, because I can't do this. Or if I was in a car accident, for instance, and I can't drive in a car. There's a lot of people experience this, at least for a while. I mean, even people who are We used to have a psychologist friend lived near us, and she was in a car accident. Not something terrible, and she wasn't even hurt so bad, but the trauma of the accident itself was terrible, and she couldn't drive for years. And she's still not really driving. And she says, this ruined my life. Because you think about a modern person not being able to drive. Well, in Israel it's a little bit easier, but still, they live now in Pardes Chana, and there, you really, even to go to the store, you have to have a car. So her life became infinitely more difficult. So what do you have to restore? You have to restore faith. Because we all perform a certain act of faith when we get in a car. We all do. We just are not so aware of it. Because we just assume it'll be okay, and so on. But when that faith has been damaged, then you have to restore it. Once you've restored it, then you can restore everything else. But you have to start from that. You have to restore faith in Hashem, that the world is not against me. Even if I was in an accident, there was a purpose to it, and so on. You have to have faith. And once you have the faith, you can begin to rebuild everything.
So that's a chilek of the divine soul.
Right. But that's true about the intellectual soul and the animal soul also, just as much. They also have a certain faith, a certain unknowable head. So the divine soul, it's clear. The faith of the divine soul, what does the divine soul believe in? Clearly, Hashem. It's that simple. And what does it want to do? It wants to make everything in my life informed, meaning shaped after that belief. So that I can even sleep with faith in Hashem. Right? That's what he said. V'shachavta, I forget the verse that we say every night. And your sleep will be good. And why will your sleep be good for you? Because you have faith in Hashem that will give you back your soul in the morning. You have to have that. Everything you do has to be informed by that. No, it's Shchavta v'Arva Shnatecha, but I remember in the middle. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
But to repair relationships, that's the first thing. I'm just thinking with my daughter, because we had been apart for so many years. I think maybe that was the first thing, was to develop.
When you have a child, you have to have faith that you can take care of them. People today don't have faith, so they don't want children.
That's so true.
You have to. It's an what we would call a super rational act to have children. It's not normal.
That's so true.
So it really comes from the divine soul. So there is some level of the intellectual soul that can also do that, but it's not as strong, and so therefore people won't have as many children. But to come and say, I'm going to have as many children as I physically can, that's an act of faith, without question. Because there's nothing else that's going to keep you going through that. I mean, even just the amount of years that you're not going to sleep. Even just that, that's a big deal. I mean, it's not like...
also more. It's the financial.
Of course, and then they get older, and they actually need money. It's not just diapers. It's like, really.
And then they get married.
And then they have those troubles. And it just goes on and on. So it's an act of faith in the end. It's a tremendous act of faith. So the divine soul, for certain, it believes in Hashem. That's its faith. That's what it believes in. What about the animal soul? What does it believe in? That we know. That's easy. No. Well, it's one way of saying it, but it believes in me. Right? That's why people talk about, like regular psychology will say, first of all, you have to restore a person's self-esteem, faith in themselves, and so on, because they're talking from the animal soul. And they're right. The animal soul can't function if it doesn't have faith in itself. If it doesn't carry faith in my life itself, in who I am. It can't function. Nothing will work. So what happens after so many failures and meltdowns and depressions and this and that? So the person loses faith in themselves. And it's not so hard. have a few of these accidents, failures, whatever, and you lose faith in yourself. And the animal soul falls down, and you have to pick it up. So strangely enough, you have to tell it, you should have faith in yourself. Which we're like, we can't do that because I'm building the animal soul. But the animal soul has to have that faith. If it doesn't have that faith, then it certainly is not going to be working with the divine soul. The divine soul is not going to have anyone to influence because there's nobody here. Nobody's listening.
So it goes together. Synergistic, you're saying?
Yeah, and if you can't obviously, if you can't restore the person's faith in themselves, so you have to go higher, and then you say, restore my faith in God. But there's also an intermediate,
The animal's faith then would be being comfortable with having a place to live, having a food to eat, that my needs are covered, rather than...
No, that would be faith in something else.
Oh,
The animal soul has to have faith in itself.
like how?
That I am capable of feeding myself. I am capable of finding shelter. I am capable, what you call surviving, but what today, like in modern society, somebody wouldn't call it surviving exactly. They'd call it, I'm capable of managing my life.
But that's just ego.
Of course it's ego.
It's totally animal.
Well, it doesn't have to necessarily be ego in the sense of
But
at the expense of someone else, right?
But your dialogue doesn't have Hashem in it.
Of course.
So it's just, okay, just
Right,
straight animal soul.
but that's what the animal soul has to believe. That's what it believes in, and if it's not functioning at that level, then the whole animal soul is not working, and that's why you get people who are homeless. And it doesn't help that you give them $1,000 because 5 minutes later, or 5 days later, or 5 weeks later, it'll be gone, and they won't be able to take that $5,000, which is a lot for a regular person whose animal soul is working, and be able to create life from it. They won't be able to because they're missing that main ingredient. They've lost faith in themselves.
Wow. Wow. So the animal manages finances, the animal...
Well, I don't know if it manages it so well, but it goes out to work because it believes that it can use the work to create a life. It believes in itself. It believes it has the power.
But don't you, like, okay, let's say you go to work, but you trust in the Eibishter that what you're going to make is from the Eibishter, not, you're putting in...
So you're already talking about how the divine soul influences the animal soul.
Oh, okay.
I'm just saying that if I isolate the animal soul, so I see that when it's hurt and its faith is broken, then something higher has to take over. Because if that's all I have, then there's nothing that's going to pick me up. An animal, for instance, let's take an actual animal. An animal that realizes that it cannot fend for itself anymore will probably just lie down and die. Because there's nothing higher that can keep it going. Right? You have to have something higher to take on the same role, to take over. So that is the intermediate, the intellectual soul. So what do I do if I find someone who's down and depressed, and so I try to convince them, even without God, just intellectually, that there have been many people in your situation and they've been able to lift themselves up. And you're right, there were many failures, but from now on you won't have failure. And I'm using the intellect to convince the person to pick themselves up, that there is a future. So what does the intellectual soul believe in then? It believes in the power of the intellect. It believes in argumentation. It believes in it. Who says that it's right? You have to understand this. It's a whole belief system that we believe that if I give you concrete arguments, they will actually mean something in the world. You have to believe that. You have to believe that math is right in order to get on, Elon Musk's whatever enterprise or whatever it's called. Okay?
Yeah, the Starship.
Starship. You have to believe that all that math is right. that all that material science is right. And some guys got on the Columbia, that didn't work out too well. Because they believed in it, but it turned out that maybe in general the math was right, but as it was applied to that particular spaceship, it wasn't right. And there were mistakes. But the animal soul, animal soul wouldn't get on a starship. It's going to be out of its mind. I mean, it would never do that. That's not normal. To get on an airplane, to get on a starship, to get on all these things, you have to have an intellectual soul. That's why we have this, you could say that after a while the animal soul would get used to the experience. It would say, "Oh, this always works," right? I mean, I'd like get on a plane. In the beginning, I'd be scared out of my wits, but then after a few minutes, I see that I'm not falling down, and it's okay. So I don't even understand why it works, but it works, and I believe that. But even that is an argument, because this is what's called the hatmadat atnuah, which means the continuation of action. Meaning, once I see that something is doing something, it'll probably continue to do that. But that's not always true in an airplane, because if you run out of fuel, right, it doesn't matter that the airplane can fly. Now it can't. So you have to understand all these things. So really, to get on a starship, I don't think any animal would ever get on that. Like, you got to be out of their minds. Like, why would, if they would understand what it's about to do? But a human being would, because we understand that there's thought involved here, and there's a whole process that's involved here. So the same thing happens when people go to a therapist, for instance. What do they believe in? They don't believe in God, and they don't believe in themselves. What do they believe? They believe the story that psychology has told them, that if you come to a therapist and you go enough times, you're going to get better. When you take a pill, what do you believe in? You don't believe in yourself, because the pill's not you, and you also don't believe in God. What are you putting your faith in? Chemistry. The chemistry is right, and this is going to do the right thing. I have terrible doubts. Really. Like, I know how these guys put these things together. I read a lot of medical literature. I read a lot of double-blind studies. And so they come up with these numbers, and then they say, well, take this. It's really 1% better than placebo. So I'd rather take a placebo than take that, because I know it's going to work about the same amount. So I don't have that faith in the mind, because I know that the mind has its limitations, and they sell it a certain way as if it's, this is true and tested and so on and so forth. But the more you know, the less the less maybe you put faith in it. But that's how the intellectual soul works. So the intellectual soul wants to believe. It has true faith in our thought process, in our logic. But that's why if you have an intellectual soul and it's very strong, you'll find it difficult to believe in God. That's why scientists have a really hard time. Because what are you asking him to do? You're asking him to supplant his current faith, which is faith in the human intellect, in intellect in general, with faith in something higher. Now, what if I showed him that the intellect that's going on in the Torah, which is, again, predicated on faith in God, because there's no Torah without faith in God. What if I showed him that the intellect there is higher than anything he could ever say? He'd be impressed by it. He'd say, wait a minute, this is a higher intellect. So that would affect his whole outlook. It wouldn't than that. It's just a low-level wisdom. And we have a lot more wisdom today from our scientific research. So then you're in a bit of a problem, because they really have a very high level. So can I bring something from the Torah that is higher level than that? So it's not exactly our topic right now, but one example would be, well, if I could show you is hard. But if I could get you to test a theory derived from Torah, and it would contradict everything you knew about science, and you'd prove it, you'd see that it's right, empirically. You might not have a theory why it works, but you empirically show that it works.
Mathematically?
Statistically. I mean, you try it, and you'd see that this works. Example would be Yaakov taking his rods and carving them, stripping them, and putting them in front of animals, and the animals giving birth to the type of engraving he made on the rod. So scientists today would say that's nonsense, it doesn't work that way. But what if it does work that way? Just try it. Do a double-blind study and see if you can and see whether it works. Do you get better than placebo? Meaning, placebo today is a hard word to use. It used to be defined that placebo was like 30%. Today we know that placebo can be 95%. It just depends on a lot of variables on how you set up the experiment. But anyway, the idea is if I could show you something I took from Torah, and it would contradict the way you understand the world right now, that might be like a real shocker. And then the person would have to say, wait a minute, maybe the source of knowledge in the Torah is higher. And it's not just coming from logic, from our human logic. Maybe it's coming from something else.
So something like, there's things like that today, like, you say a bracha on a kos of mayim and the molecular structure.
Right, so that's why people look for these things all the time.
And there was that thing that went around in the war, like we shoot the rockets and their God changes their course.
I don't know if that was a double-blind study. Right. You have to shoot decoy rockets also. One of the things that we have here, that we talk here a lot about, is lowliness, shiftless. It's something that they never talk about in regular psychology. They'll never mention it because it runs against the grain of what we just said, that the animal soul has to believe in itself. So that for them, that's like putting the animal soul down. That's how most people understand it, and they don't see it. This is a. In the end, to me, it sounds like just a logical eitzah. It doesn't sound so divine to me. But I realize that it came from a divine source. It's King David saying, "This is how I'm going to rule. This is how I'm going to," and this being the single most important piece of advice that I can give to anyone psychologically about how to live a good life, about well-being. Yeah, well-being depends on your lowliness. The more lowly you are, the better your life is going to be, miraculously. Why? Because everybody thinks that if I'm lowly, that's going to hurt my self-esteem. That's going to hurt my being and my ability to pursue things. At the very least, I'm going to stay in bed all day, not doing anything. But I'm lowly. How can I possibly do anything? So ideals like this, they come and they supplant the intellectual soul's understanding, its faith, and then the whole point is then that the intellectual soul does find a way, because we try to explain lowliness, for instance, in a way that does make sense to the intellectual soul, and then it tells the animal soul, look, I know that for you the most important thing in the world is to have faith in yourself, but let's suspend that faith for a moment and see what happens if you don't have faith in yourself. What will happen if you are willing to go higher? So that only the intellectual soul can say, because the intellectual soul has been convinced that what the Torah is saying is of a higher degree of wisdom than the wisdom I've gathered from just thinking about it myself.
Wow. So we should only use the intellect as a tool,
right,
to get to.
Right.
Okay.
And if it's used as an end game, like as an end in and of itself, it detaches from godliness, and that's where you get like science. By the way, science doesn't mean that it's wrong. It could be in the same way that the animal soul is not wrong when it says I have to have faith in myself. It's not wrong. It's just a lower level of being. And I want to shift it to a higher. Why? Because if all you have is faith in yourself, what happens when you start failing? There will be nothing to pick you up. Same thing, Nazi Germany. Germany churning into Nazi Germany. if all you have is morality that was developed by the intellect, what happens when, for very good reasons, you don't want to be moral anymore? Because the world did this to you, and the Jews are like this to you, and I don't know, whatever you think. So what's going to hold your morality up when that crashes down? So you have to have this higher level. You always have to have this higher level. So in a regular person, again, we said if he's a non-Jew, so the intellect serves that function. So that the person doesn't completely fall down. But sometimes they do. And they become homeless. And you have to start trying to rebuild their intellect, but it's not always possible. I don't know if you've ever had long conversations with people who are homeless. They're very tough conversations. They don't seem to be going anywhere. Like they're just...
There are some people, homeless people, who actually will say they're very happy being homeless. That they would rather... You try to convince them to go to a place where they can, you know, like in America, to go to a place where they take care of homeless people. They don't want to go.
Why?
Because it's not a good place, or they can come up with all these excuses, you know.
Because the intellect is no longer serving them.
Oh, that.
Yeah, because let's say that you lost your house for some reason, and you had to go begging for help from other people. What would be your first priority after that? Is to rebuild your life. You wouldn't leave it like that.
No, I'd go move on.
Right, because your intellect is still... And after that, very quickly, you'd come to the realization that I have a life ahead of me, and I can't live my life this way. And that is because you at least have your intellect still in place. But let's say you lose your intellect. And so then you have to rely on something higher. And the something higher is the divine soul already. And the divine soul says, לעולם יזכור אדם עצמו לעבודה זרה ואל יצטרך לבריות. That a person should even do strange labor. Avodah Zarah here doesn't mean idolatry, even though Moshe's grandson made the mistake, that's what he understood. But it doesn't mean idolatry, it means to do strange labor, like really strange stuff, anything as demeaning as it is, and not to be dependent on other people. Why? Because now you have to have belief that, Chazal say this everywhere, even if you have enough money to never work, you should work. Why? Because you should work in Torah. Then you become Amel B'Torah, you become working in Torah, but you should be doing something, because a life spent just surviving, let's call it, or just meeting my animal needs, is a life wasted. You wasted your whole time here. Because the whole point was to get to a higher level, and the only way to get to a higher level is to be independent. The only way to be independent is really to be able to build your life. So you have to have this faith in Hashem, who's telling you, I created you to be independent. That's what I wanted from you in the first place.
So this communication between the different
levels. Right.
This can't be a conscious thing. I mean,
Well, why not? Well, when we're in a class, we sort of do it consciously.
yeah.
But people who think, spend time thinking, and every person, I would hope, would spend some time thinking every day. So you're communicating between the levels. But most of what we do in this class, for instance, is we take a concept from Torah and we try to translate it into intellectual language. So it's a type of thinking. I mean, it's a conversation that's trying to get you to think.
So what happens when you lose say you lose the divine level, the spiritual level?
Right.
Then where are you?
You're prone to fall. I mean, it could be that your intellect will hold you your whole time, but you're prone to fall. And more importantly, if you believe that in the end, the connection with God is the most important connection that you can have, then you've taken that whole reality out of your life. You've taken that whole dimension of life out of your life. So if you don't have a divine soul. So we're going to talk about why, or what it means that we want to teach the whole world through its intellectual soul, through it, how to have an appreciation for the divine soul, even if they don't have a divine soul yet, but they can have an appreciation of it. And that's what we call that. That's what we say, that every person has a spark of the divine. They may not have a whole soul. We'll talk about the differences, but they may not have the whole thing, but they have some spark of it. And that spark is enough for me to be able to talk to them in an intellectual way that leads to a higher consciousness. But that's not necessarily the topic. The topic really is to understand the intellectual soul. Okay? So what I printed out here, I thought we'd read it and I'd translate it for you, but we don't have time. So I'll just tell you, is the one mimer where the one essay where the Alter Rebbe really discusses the nature of the intellectual soul, and right away he drops a bombshell. And the bombshell is, well, there's a few bombshells here, but the big one is that every day you get a new intellectual soul.
Wow, I like that.
Every day you get a new intellectual soul. Every day has its thoughts, its work in the intellectual soul, and every day, in the same way that the animal soul needs to be worked on constantly, but you might say that my animal soul is pretty constant. It doesn't change, but the intellectual soul does. It's very dynamic. And the divine soul also doesn't change so much. So it's actually that the intellectual soul is the secret of life. It's what distinguishes one day from the next. And when you think about it, most people, we should be at such a level that we would be able to chart our days, remember them based on how we davened. Most people don't remember. Why do they not remember? Because we do it by rote. And even when there's very, very good times that we daven, we usually forget it because it's very uncommon. But when people they write a journal. By the way, this is a really great tool because a lot of people develop because of that journal.
About davening?
No, I'm saying when normal people write a journal, it's about their thoughts.
Journal.
It's about their intellectual soul. They're actually writing a history of how. Now the fact that people don't do it is actually detrimental, because you have no record of your development. You don't see the development. It's very important to see it. Yeah.
So instead of like a new intellect each day, it's really like algorithmic, right? Where it's in a development, like it's advancing.
So it's not what we would call ishtalshalut. Ishtalshalut means that it's not cause and effect. It's not that yesterday's thoughts lead to today's thoughts. Rather, every day is a new garment. It's like I wear a whole new garment every day. My intellect is something different every day.
Wow, like really, like.
I don't use it, maybe. I don't use it, maybe. But that's what Hashem is giving me. And the name of that, and that's what we'll see next time, is the Tselem. That's what it means to have an image of God.
The
Tselem. Tselem. Tselem Elokim. God created man in God's image. So it's usually translated as image. Tselem. Today you have a matzlema, which is a camera, because it creates images. But this word tselem is a little bit difficult to understand. It's about half and half. Half of the interpreters of the Torah say that tselem comes from the word darkness, actually. Like in Arabic, al-salam. Al-salam is darkness. When you want to say that I'm going to the darkness, or the darkness, salam. And half of them say no, that it's actually light. So we'll have to deal with this, because this is a very important concept. Okay, so we'll end here today. And so this was an introduction to our new topic. And God willing, we'll see more and more of this.
Just not thinking about it all that much, but my experience is that Mechadesh B'Tuvot, the day is different. But you're saying, no,
You're different.
so much the day, like what I'm perceiving as the day is really my intellectual soul.
It's the same. It's the same thing. It's why. When do you daven? When is the most opportune, auspicious time to daven? It's when the sun rises. Right, what's going on? Because it's like saying that with every day I'm like a new person. Like the day is new, and if I grab that, I can use it for something. A lot of times when you, especially if you don't journal, because it's hard to journal. But there's all these testimonials about people that now have. You look at all the great thinkers in the world, all the people who became really important people in the end. They journaled. So it's very important. And the most famous one is the one that I always say. He's Rebbe's Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius. So his thoughts or meditations, as they're called, are basically his journal. And a lot of people, they search for what can I gather from my life so that I can document later in life what I did. So all these important people, you get these autobiographies, and they're searching for information because as it was happening, they didn't always write it down. But there are certain people like Henry Kissinger, who's now, I think today or yesterday, became 100 years old. He's still alive. It's unbelievable. And he's just as sharp as he was. I just heard a podcast with him. And he's famous for doing this all the time. Yeah. Very important to him. So I don't know. I do it when I have important thoughts. I don't want to lose them. But I don't do it consistently. But I know that the time periods in my life when I did do it consistently, it led to a certain boost in how much I was able to take advantage of my thinking powers. Because I find myself many, many times repeating the same thing again. Like, I can't say how many times. Like a whole understanding that I lose because I don't journal, because I don't keep a record of where I was. I spend a lot of hours every day reading. The same thing happens in Gemara and in Halacha. If you don't keep a record of what you've done, where you are, you lose it. You really lose it.
Have a digital trail. Like I could
right. So you can sort of but there's no digital trail when you read from books. So you have to sort of create the trail yourself.
Just a few lines.
Nothing more. It doesn't take more than that. But usually you find that if you start writing, you have a lot more to say than just a few lines. And actually, it itself becomes a sort of a summation process on the day, and sort of like puts things in their place. And because again, after you go to sleep and you wake up, it's not linear. There's no connection almost. Like you start from a completely different point. That's his idea, that the tzelem is completely new every day.
Wow. Yeah, like you can go to bed so stressed with all these problems on your mind, and then you wake up and you're like, "Wow, I feel good today."
Not everyone's like that, but yeah. But I'm like you. If I can go to sleep, everything will be fine.
Yeah.
So when a person has a lot of anxiety, where does that come from? Their animal self?
Yeah, usually. But it could also be that their intellectual soul understands that the financial situation is really dire, and the animal soul shouldn't have any problems because there's food in the cupboard. So what's the big issue? So it depends on which kind of anxiety. Usually, anxiety is some kind of process that began a long time ago. It's not like a direct.
You can build anxiety. Okay, so I was in New York, and I haven't driven for a really long time, and I had to. We had rented a car, so I was taking my daughter-in-law's car to pick him up, and I had to go. And this is in Staten Island, so it's not a major freeway. I hadn't been on a freeway for who knows when, and I built up so much anxiety driving to get on that freeway. And when I did it, it was like, this is nothing. Like this is like I did. I've been driving since I was very, very young.
So that I would say is more the animal soul, because it's just not. It's just not
building it up.
No, but if you had been in an accident, and then so that's
No.
more the intellectual
I've been in
soul,
accidents, but
right? It didn't have that effect.
that was not the result.
But to your point from last week, I had this conversation with some people last night in the Hebrew class, and we all agreed, and I mentioned you, that the best thing is to just and move forward, like we're all like Dima, like that's, and then
That's with the animal soul.
Came up, but
That's with the animal soul. With the intellectual soul, you should, because it's a process. It's a long process, and usually the intellect develops over your life. The animal soul doesn't develop that much. It's sort of like, big changes in the animal soul is I didn't used to like vegetables, now I do. It doesn't really go through that big of a transformation. I used to think that Coca-Cola was the best drink in the world. Now I think that good wine is. Animal soul is not that sophisticated.
So when you said you were talking about trauma, like to leave trauma in the past,
right?
And focus on now.
Right. So you can do that if you have a strong intellect. And that takes the place of the animal soul, which is sort of locked into where you left it.
The anxieties in the animal.
Right.
Okay, so whenever I get on a plane, I'm the one that has to hold it up, right? Everybody else can go to sleep and I'm sitting there.
And if you don't hold it, it's going to fall down.
Right, absolutely.
I'm in touch with that.
What happens when I'm not there? I really don't understand it, but
well, part of you is there.
I keep the planes up.
Right.
Absolutely.
So that's ego. That's 100% ego.
Absolutely, I love it.
Yeah. But I'm saying if your ego is big enough, you can hold up all the planes. You don't have to.
So I'm gonna.
Okay.
Wow.
We'll continue next week, God willing.